So tonight's event was an annual review of financial sustainability in football. So what we did is we looked back over the past 12 months and picked out the key developments that we think the public need to know about. So one of these is Manchester City's case against the Premier League. We looked at the football governance bill. We looked at the new squad cost rules coming in place in the Premier League, and also had a case against sustainability by Kieran Maguire.
We're delighted to welcome so many of you to this evening's event, which is an annual review on financial sustainability in football. My name's Tom Murray and I'm a legal director here at Mishcons. I also head up our Sports Law Academy programme. I regularly advise clubs on PSR matters and co-wrote the financial regulation chapter in Nick DeMarco's leading textbook, Football and the Law, along with my colleague Simon Leaf. Now, 10 years ago, if I'd have told you that we'd have 300 people sign up to the event to hear 2 lawyers and 2 accountants talk about financial sustainability, you probably would have laughed at me. But in today's world, what happens in the boardroom and often the courtroom is just as likely to be a newspaper headline as what happens on the pitch. And this has turned our panel into stars. Nick is regularly featured in The Times, and Kieran is now on TV more than Gary Neville. Tonight, we're joined by the best and the brightest of those working in financial sustainability. First up, we have tonight's host and self-entitled Socratic interloper, Nick DeMarco KC. Now, Nick is a KC at Blackstone Chambers and a go-to barrister for sports disputes. He's regularly instructed by Premier League and EFL clubs and has acted on the last count on 45 clubs in England. In the context of FFP, Nick's acted for the likes of Leicester City, Nottingham Forest, Sheffield Wednesday, Derby County, his beloved QPR, AFC Bournemouth, and is one of the true experts in this area. Next up, we have on the far side, we have Felix Vetter. So Felix is the managing director of Ancura, a firm of experts and advisors who have acted on some of the most high-profile Premier League PSR cases. Now, Felix is a forensic accountant with over 12 years' experience. And finally, we have Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire, whose voice you'll no doubt recognise from the Price of Football podcast. So Kieran is the author of the Price of Football book, which I have on my desk, and also Unfit and Improper Persons, and is a regular expert who appears in the television and the press. Now, for tonight's event, many of the views which people will share won't necessarily reflect their own personal or professional views. So if you are attributing views to a certain person, please consider that. Thank you in advance to our panel, and I'll now pass you over to the eminent Nick DeMarco.
Thank you very much. And I was going to start with something very similar about who would have thought that the sexiest subject in sport is now financial regulation in football, but it is. You can hardly turn on the radio these days without hearing someone like Kieran talk about amortization or some other word that most football fans might have been unfamiliar with 10 years ago. But it's now so central to so much of what we do. And the 2 experts sitting on my right, along with Tom, provide a really good panel to discuss it. What we're going to do is discuss some of the perhaps more controversial and interesting and dynamic areas today. First of all, Tom's going to give a short introduction, which he's already done. Sorry. That was good. That was great. Yeah. Do another one. So we're then going to move on to some presentations. Felix is going to go first. He's going to do an introduction to the FFP PSR rules, but also what may be or may not be replacing them, the squad cap rules that have been spoken about. And then Kieran's going to make a sort of polemic argument, I think, in favour of non-sustainability, it's written down here, and Newcastle United. And then Tom is going to give us, and these are all going to be about 5 or 10 minute bite-sized chunks. Tom is going to give us an insight into the Man City and Premier League arbitrations insofar as such can be given. And then we're going to have some even shorter bite-sized pieces. I might say a little bit about the problems with these rules in respect of promotion and relegation between the leagues, in particular thinking about the Nottingham Forest case and the Leicester City case. And then Tom and Felix will say something about associated party transactions. The Chelsea women's recent transaction you will have heard about, Kieran will speak about, and we all might chip in on these bits. And then football governance bill and how that may be affected by or affect all these types of developments. I think Kieran and Felix are going to lead on that. But that will all be, I think, a bit, we'll all chip in if we can. And then finally, at about 6:30, if we do this properly, you can all ask questions. So please do store them up and get them ready. And have any questions you have. We'll have 15 minutes for that, and at 8:45 we'll have drinks. And so I think we should start straight away with Felix giving us that introduction.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I thought I'd start off with, I know probably a lot of you already know, but a sort of brief explainer of PSR and FFP. So I think Nick and Tom have already explained the sort of significance of the topic now, and I think release of, I guess, certain clubs' accounts last week has also sort of driven more stories in the press around this. So in the Premier League, we obviously have the profitability and sustainability rules, which are effectively a son of FFP as a term in general. UEFA have their own rules, financial sustainability regulations. They do, the two rules do operate quite differently. They're different in different formats. They apply differently, and also the enforcement is quite different. So high level, so the Premier League rules, they focus on profitability, so allowable losses over a 3-year period of £105 million, depending on certain levels of investment in the team by the owners. The UEFA have obviously, as most people are probably aware, moved on to a new squad cost rule, which we'll explain a bit more detail in a moment. But alongside that, they still also have a football earnings rule, so similar to the Premier League's rule, but they have a different maximum allowable loss, which is 90 million euros. Again, it slightly depends on the club's performance and investment by the owners. Another important aspect when looking at these numbers is to know that it's not about the headline numbers that you might see reported or in the club accounts. There's deductions allowed for effectively good expenditure, so community expenditure, infrastructure, youth, women's football. So that's sort of some basics. Then I also just wanted to sort of talk about a little bit about, has FFP so far been a success? So I think we have to look at it from the point of view of sustainability, not fair play as it might be or historically has been described. So a lot of analysis done by UEFA generally shows that profitability across Europe in clubs has improved. COVID has had an impact on that. So a lot of the numbers pre-COVID show good improvement. Obviously, that had a significant impact, but more recent reporting has also shown that there's been a reduction in the sort of large growth of player wages that we've seen, and that these are now growing at a lesser rate than revenues, so potentially showing that some of these rules are starting to bite. Also wanted to talk a little about enforcement. So I think historically a lot of these rules probably seen more of a sort of slap on the wrist, but I think some of the more recent, I guess more stringent enforcement by the Premier League in terms of applying points deductions has really changed the view on that for many clubs. One area that the rules have led to is certain activities driven by the accounting rules. So an obvious one is the sale of academy players. So the sale of academy players, effectively because they're held by clubs at no value, allow full profit to be recognised on their sale. So there's sort of been a drive of clubs making those sales, especially potentially around the year end if they see that they're short on their results. And I guess the other area that we see a lot of reporting around is the circumvention. And some reporting even suggested recently that it's effectively making the rules meaningless. I'm not sure I would quite agree with that, but there are certainly examples of what you may describe as circumvention. So one of the sort of simpler methods, right, the sort of outset was longer term contracts, i.e. over 5 years, 8 years, player contracts, allowing you to sort of spread that cost over a much longer term. That was quickly limited by the regulators to 5 years. Another thing that we've seen recently, especially last June, was an unprecedented number of player swaps. So these were sort of convenient transactions that went both ways, happened at the same time, but were by the clubs described as absolutely independent and definitely not swaps. Again, certainly all this activity driven by the accounting rules. And again, more recently, we've also seen those intragroup sales of assets, businesses, again, that was something, a rule that the Premier League could have changed, and I believe they had a vote on it last year, but chose not to. So what's changing? So to date, FFP rules in England have generally looked at losses or profitability. So the new regime specifically looks at the value of the squad against revenue. So some of the sort of drivers behind that sort of potential change in approach is success of salary caps in the US, and a thought that this would be more targeted at overspending and the sort of financial issues that some clubs have faced. I've also read some arguments that this may lead to sort of less ability to circumvent, but Kieran will probably agree with me that if a club wants to, there's still plenty of ways of doing that, even with the new rules. So just to briefly explain the squad cost rules that I guess UEFA already have and the Premier League are considering. So effectively, there's sort of a soft salary cap. You take all the first team player wages of the head coach, plus the amortization of the transfer fee, so effectively your annual cost of your player purchases. And you take that as a ratio of the income generated by the club plus the profit from player sales. And UEFA started at a 90% limit, now down to 70%. And I believe the Premier League are talking about limiting this to 85%. The other concept that's been discussed, and this is specific to the Premier League, is this concept of anchoring. So this would effectively provide a maximum amount of how much a club can spend on their squad. So, and the anchor will be, well, the discussion is that will be based on the Premier League broadcast income of the lowest finishing club in the league. So it's just over 100 million, I believe, on sort of more recent numbers. So it will be a multiple of that, undecided what that will be. But take a 5-time multiple, that would effectively mean that you could spend up to 500 million on your squad. And we'll talk about in a minute a bit as to what that potentially might mean. So I guess what's the impact of potential change in regime, and I guess some of the impact already seen with the change in the UEFA rules. So even under the new regime, the limit is still linked to a club's revenue. So a club like Manchester City would still have an ability to spend over 500 million a year on their squad, even with that limit, whereas someone like Aston Villa, for example, would only be able to spend about 250 million. So there's still an enormous gap between the clubs. And I think probably the biggest challenge is for those challenger clubs, Newcastle, Aston Villa, that are sort of trying to come up. So it's not going to generate a level playing field as such, but I guess, is that the objective? So obviously UEFA's objective is long-term financial sustainability and stability of clubs to operate within their means. And each club is different. They all have different incomes, revenues. So, is linking it to those actually the fairest way of doing it? Looking at that concept of anchoring again, that potentially would, depending on where the anchor is set, could have an actual impact on competitiveness. So for example, if you set it at 3, so limiting the squad costs to 300 million, suddenly clubs like Chelsea, Manchester City couldn't spend all the money that they previously could. So that potentially would then have a big impact, but obviously that comes with a lot of other challenges, legal challenges, I'm sure, and then also impact on potential competitiveness in Europe against other clubs, Spanish clubs, for example, or the Bundesliga. So squad cost would definitely be a big change as we're moving away from assessing profitability. And one of the potential, I guess, consequences is, for example, debt taken on by clubs. So at the moment, if you take on debt, generally the interest payments come into your losses or affect your profitability. So those get taken into account. For example, under squad costs, you don't consider costs in that sense. So is there a risk that clubs end up taking on a lot more debt than they have under the current regime, where you may have those limits. Another important factor in the impact of those rules is going to be the enforcement. So obviously, PSR rules are now more stringently enforced, as led to some change in club behaviours. Obviously, we don't know yet what the enforcement regime will be for these rules, but it will certainly impact heavily on how they'll be seen. And then I also briefly wanted to talk about potentially some of the unintended consequences of move to the new rules. So, for example, some of the current trends that we've seen from the rules in terms of that sale of homegrown players, player swaps, those won't change because the income from those is still relevant. So I don't see any changes in those types of behaviours under the rules as currently designed or proposed. Potentially, we could see a change in those intergroup sales. And again, it will depend obviously on the specific drafting, but for example, under UEFA rules, those are generally not allowed. It probably, again, won't solve that issue around circumvention and, that sort of disbelief by fans as to how certain clubs are potentially perceived to be getting around. I think that will remain, and there'll still be tricks of new tricks that we'll potentially see. And one example, just wanted to talk through that we may see. So this is potentially what I call grossing up of revenues. So just to sort of give an example, if you run a club running a club store, you may run it on a profit share basis. So you effectively ask another party to come in, run that store for you, and they effectively give you a share of the profits. So let's say they give you 50 million is the share of your profits for the year. Under the squad cost rule of 85%, that effectively means you can spend 42.5 million on your squad. You could set this up in a different way, i.e. you run the store yourself, which effectively means you get all of the revenue, but you also bear all of the costs. So in this example, you would have, let's say, 100 million of revenue from that store, but you also have the cost of operating a store, let's call it 50. You end up with the same profit, but actually the amount that you can put into your squad cost calculation is 100. So suddenly you can spend 85 million. So similar models could potentially be used in hospitality and lots of other areas of football clubs. And we're really seeing in Spain increasingly complex models of some of these areas. So, potential question marks there of, whether that will ultimately lead to the goal of sustainability. That was sort of, the main things initially wanted to just...
So thank you very much for that comprehensive introduction. Could you just clarify one thing, which is that my understanding is that the squad cost rules, there's no certainty at all they'll ever come in this country now, is there? Because they were meant to get through the Premier League recently, and a number of clubs seemed not that happy about them and perhaps preferred to stick with the old rules even. So we don't now know whether they're certainly not going to come in next season.
No.
But we don't now know whether they'll come in at all. Is that right?
Yeah, as far as I know, yes. And I believe some of the ongoing APT cases with Man City had an impact on that, waiting for the outcome of those, as some of that may impact. So, yeah.
Okay. So I think we're now going to have a polemic argument from Kieran.
Yeah, I've got slides. Is it okay if I stand? Because otherwise I won't be able to see what I've written. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Kieran. I'm a teacher. I teach at the University of Liverpool. I also teach for the Professional Footballers Association. I also teach for the League Managers Association. I also teach at Canary Wharf and Wall Street. Probably not going there in the next few weeks. They've got other things to occupy their minds. So this is a talk about the issues of sustainability. So my argument is going to be a contrarian one, and these are not necessarily my views, but the argument's going to be sustainability. Do we need it? So let's start off. If you take a look at the Premier League handbook, it's got the definition of 137 different terms. It does not include the definition of sustainability. So therefore I had to find another source, and that source was Charles Dickens. I went to David Copperfield and Wilkins Micawber. This is sustainability. This is sustainability in the eyes of most people who have an understanding of broad finance, i.e. don't live outside of your means. And if you take a look at the statement which came from Daniel Levy when the Spurs annual report was announced in the last 24, 48 hours, he was effectively reflecting that particular view. So he wants Spurs to be a sustainable football club. Let's take a look at something which is pre-sustainable era. This is the Premier League trophies that were awarded. What we had before the introduction of new owners who took the belief that sustainability was an irrelevance was a duopoly as far as the Premier League was concerned. Manchester United won it every season in the few years when Arsenal used to go and take it from them. And actually, the Premier League was becoming a bit of a boring product as a result of that. If you take a look at those countries where one or two clubs are winning the trophies every year, and then you take a look at the value of the TV rights, those TV rights tend to be lower. So what we have now, we have a new era of football. So I'm going to give you an example of one club which has been both sustainable and not sustainable, and we'll take a look at the reaction of stakeholders. Under Mike Ashley, Newcastle United made a profit in the Premier League years of £132 million. That is to be applauded if you are an accountant and if you believe that the accountant's perception is the one which should be dominant. Yet, Mike Ashley was not being cheered to the rafters by the Newcastle fan base, because when the ambition of the club is to finish 17th or higher, then that becomes quite disillusioning. If you take a look at the number of empty seats, if you took a look at the incentives that the club was undertaking in order to try to pretend there were more people at St James's than there actually were, it was quite noticeable. We've had the takeover of Newcastle United in subsequent years, and since PIF acquired the club, Newcastle United is no longer a sustainable football club in the traditional viewpoint, because under PIF in 3 seasons, the club's lost £157 million. And yet, 10 days ago, 300,000 people in Newcastle went to celebrate the winning of the Rumbelows Cup. 300,000 people. So does our perception as professionals in law and finance, does that reflect the views of other stakeholders in the game? And is sustainability focused on the wrong stakeholders? If we take a look at the biggest loss-making clubs in the period 2004 to 2021, so this is also known as the Abramovich era in football. So here I've got a table. These are the 5 biggest loss-making clubs. During that period of time, Chelsea Football Club and Manchester City Football Club, between them, lost £1.6 billion. During that period of time, Manchester City and Chelsea Football Club also won the Premier League on 11 occasions. They won the FA Cup on 9 occasions. They won the Champions League on 3 occasions. And they won the Rumbelows Cup on 8 occasions. So sustainability says this is an unsuccessful model. If I'm teaching this in traditional business schools style, I would say that's not a way to run a business. And yet, if we go to the Champions League final in 2021, it was contested between these 2 clubs. How many trophies did Manchester City and Chelsea win during the pre-sustainable era? Manchester City were in the 3rd division for part of that time. Chelsea would occasionally win the FA Cup. And yet the transformation into, first of all, destroying the duopoly that we had, and secondly, making these clubs successful on the pitch, let's take a look at it from the perspective of different stakeholders. The owners are happy, they're getting high profile, they're getting soft power. The players are happy because their wages have gone from being mid-tier to top tier. The fans are happy because they're winning trophies. Where is the downside of having a non-sustainable football club? Well, you could argue that the downside is, if you're Everton, that was not sustainable during that same period of time, and the club was in danger of going out of business. Aston Villa at one point in time were within 24 hours of going into liquidation, let alone administration. So that's the risk. But business is full of risk. Should football clubs be deemed to be treated differently? Do we see other sports being run in a sustainable manner? The America's Cup, how much did that cost? Offshore gym? In terms of funding the America's Cup bid, it was millions and millions of pounds. I don't know if any of you have got shares in racehorses, but the racehorsing industry loses money. So if we have other sports which are not sustainable, and yet they continue to exist, why should we separate football into being sustainable stroke profitable, which appears to be the ambitions and aims of the administrators and the regulators? And then, if we're going to say that sport should be sustainable, do we apply those same principles to the rest of our life? So let's take a look at two of the biggest issues which are likely to affect us. First of all, having children. How many of you have made a profit? Yes, you add up school fees, you add up holiday fees, you add up nanny fees, you add up clothing, you add up clothes. How many of us have made a profit? And yet, that's the most important thing in our lives, the welfare and the upbringing of our children. We don't do it for financial reasons. Why should we therefore apply the same to football? What else? The second, probably the most important thing, getting married. You know, you don't work out that financially. My first divorce, notwithstanding, my second probably shortly to arrive, given the amount of media work I'm doing at present. So if we take a look at returns on investment, if we take a look at sustainability in our own lives, we don't apply those principles. So why should we apply them to football? So that's forming the basis of my talk. So what is football? I've said that the two most important things is the person that you love and your children, of course, you love as well. Well, how does football fit into our life? One has to therefore go to the coolest man that has ever been in the sport, the one and only Carlo Ancelotti. And what does he say? Football is the next most important thing. It's the most important of the least important things in life. If I list out the 10 most important events in my life, 7 of them involve Brighton and Hove Albion. I've got 2 kids and 1 wife. They fit in. And yeah, my wife, she's number 6. She's happy. Yeah, I've explained the importance of Hereford in '97 to her, and she doesn't. So my argument, ladies and gentlemen, is as follows. That we have our focus incorrect. We have our focus on financial sustainability. And actually, what we have in football is a trophy asset model. The people that have come into the game, who have spent vast sums, who have transformed the game into what we see today, they're not looking for a financial return. PIF are not going to go bust. Sheikh Mansour is not going to go bust. Tony Bloom is not going to wake up one morning and say to himself, I'm getting a bit bored of Brighton, I'm just going to chuck it all in. So provided we have a series of appropriate checks and balances, having a different system for football, allowing challenger clubs, as Felix has said, to be able to challenge is actually good for the game. Because since the introduction of non-sustainability, we've had Chelsea winning the Premier League, Manchester City winning the Premier League, Liverpool winning the Premier League, and Leicester City winning the Premier League. And I would argue that none of that would have happened had we stuck to making profits.
Thank you very much, Kieran, for that excellent argument. And I'll be interested to hear if anyone in the questions and comments stage can put forward a counter argument. Given time, I'm going to hand straight over to Tom to talk about the Man City case.
Thanks very much. Just to counter a couple of the points made by Kieran. So there's plenty of other sports where financial sustainability exists. So Formula One, rugby, NFL, all have various models to control spending or losses. He also points out that two of the most important life events in his life, you wouldn't ever consider financial sustainability, one of which was marriage and one was children. I think if we were to analyse this from a footballing lens, at least for Kieran, spending money on a marriage could be seen as an investment into the women's game, which is actually exempt. And spending money on children could be seen as investment into the academy, which is also exempt. Anyway, I'm here to talk about Manchester City. And I must admit that when we were planning this event, I did think we were going to have a decision by now. And we could have had this could be dissected and discussed by lawyers and accountants alike, but instead we're all still waiting. So this has been a really long and complicated process, and you'll probably be forgiven for forgetting how the hell did we even get to this point. So I'm going to give a quick run through how we got to these proceedings, and then also talk about what's the likely outcome. We don't know. When we expect a decision, we don't know. So let's get started. So back in November 2018, there was a German newspaper called Der Spiegel who, for a series of leaks, revealed that Manchester City had inflated its revenues. So this then led to a UEFA investigation, and in February 2020, UEFA's appeals chamber released a statement confirming that they had found Manchester City had committed serious breaches of the UEFA FFP regulations in two ways. So first of all, they overstated their sponsorship revenue in their accounts, and secondly, they failed to cooperate with the UEFA investigation. So Manchester City originally were given a fine of 30 million euros and were banned for UEFA competitions for 2 years. Manchester City thought, we're not going to have any of this. So they appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And in July 2020, CAS found that whilst Manchester City had committed severe and serious breaches of the duty to cooperate, from which they received a 10 million euro fine, certain alleged breaches were time barred, so UEFA have a 5-year prosecution period to take action, which they didn't, and the remaining alleged breaches were not sufficiently made out given the severity of their allegations. So Manchester City essentially before UEFA got away with a 10 million euro fine. So then the Premier League at the similar sort of time, so this is December 2018, commenced its own disciplinary investigation into Manchester City, and they sought various documents from the club. So as was the case before the Court of Arbitration for Sport and UEFA, there was a litany of legal challenges by Manchester City. So first of all, Manchester City said, look, we're not going to disclose certain documents to you. The Premier League then brought an arbitration against Manchester City to encourage disclosure. Since then, Manchester City had an unsuccessful challenge to the jurisdiction of these arbitrators. They also had an unsuccessful application to the Commercial Court, where they're arguing that the arbitration panel was biased. This led to a judgment which was given in March 2021. They then tried to appeal that judgment. So they then tried to prevent publication of that judgment and said that this was a private matter. The Commercial Court said, no, we're going to publish it. They then sought an application to appeal for the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal ruled in the Premier League's favour. So then after 4 years of investigation, in February 2023, we finally had this press release from the Premier League to say, and everyone remembers the famous number, 115 breaches of the Premier League rules had been referred to a commission. There's also a kind of set of additional proceedings that relate to associated party transactions, but we'll discuss that more generally as part of the panel. So what do these charges relate to? So there's this magical number 115, which is burnt into the football folklore and everyone's memory. It's actually suggested now that it's more than that, it's 130 charges. And arguably you can split these up into 3 main buckets. So first of all, Manchester City are accused of disguising putting money into the club as sponsorship. The reason you do that, it inflates your profit. You can then use that money to spend on players, or you are less likely to get in trouble for breaching the upper loss threshold. Secondly, they're accused of paying money to staff through a third party. Why would you do this? It would reduce your losses. And thirdly, surprise, surprise, they're accused of not cooperating with the Premier League. So when do we expect a decision? I wish I could tell you. And I suspect with most members of the panel, we've been queued up for a couple of months now to speak to various news outlets to analyse the decision. I'm still waiting to go on holiday so I can do that. But only a handful of people in the country really know when this decision is going to be released. And there is, of course, the high likelihood that we have a decision as to liability before we have a decision as to sanction. So we could be waiting a while to find out what the sanction is, if any. So what's the likely outcome? Well, most people think that there will be some sort of points deduction. And the reason people argue in favour of points deduction is they say that a fine or a warning or a transfer embargo just isn't a sufficient disincentive to prevent this type of behaviour. If we look at recent cases, there's certainly a trend towards a points deduction being seen as the most appropriate sanction. So in February 2024, Everton received a points deduction. It was originally 10 points. It was then reduced to 6 points. They exceeded the 105 million upper loss threshold by 24.5 million. The following month, Nottingham Forest then received a 4-point deduction, having admitted that it had breached the relevant PSR threshold, which was slightly less because they'd spent some time in the Championship. And they were also found in that case to have demonstrated exceptional cooperation with its dealings with the Premier League, which I think is unlikely in Man City's case. But look, it's well understood and acknowledged that the primary purpose of the sanction isn't to punish the club. It's to try and protect the integrity of the competition, people's confidence in the competition, and to ensure fairness between clubs in a proportionate manner, which I think most fans will agree has been lost throughout this case. I would say that depending on the outcome of the breach, I don't think we should fully rule out expulsion. The reason I say that is in the Nottingham Forest case, there was a kind of throwaway line that said, where a PSR breach is described as major, then it may be the case that a very severe sanction, such as expulsion, is more appropriate. So let's wait to see what the outcome of this is. So what are the likely implications of this decision? Well, first of all, I think we can expect that there'll be a huge crowd of clubs seeking compensation under the Premier League rules. And this is something which is permitted and has been acknowledged. So Nick will remember well in 2023, Leeds United, Nottingham Forest, Southampton, Leicester City and Burnley sought to intervene in proceedings against Everton. And there was an analysis of a very specific rule under the Premier League rules. And it was held that whilst this does enable a club to seek compensation, it doesn't enable them to participate in the issue of whether or not a breach has occurred in the first place. And it also does not extend to allowing the disclosure of certain documents. We also understand that Burnley have sought compensation against Everton, having been relegated in the 2021-22 season. So they fell 4 points behind Everton. And if Everton's points deduction was 6 points, the argument is, well, had they received the 6-point deduction in that season, then we would have stayed up. The real challenge with these types of claims is causation. Can you prove that the wrongdoing resulted in the relevant loss? So if Burnley had been able to spend more money on players, would they have stayed up? And that's the really difficult argument to try and run. There's been kind of similar historic cases. So people remember the famous move of Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano to West Ham. Sheffield United sought action against West Ham and were paid a settlement of 18 million, reportedly. There's also kind of similar settlements elsewhere in the Championship between Middlesbrough and Derby County and also Wycombe Wanderers. In the context of Manchester City, I suspect there will be lots of claims for compensation, and you can think about what these are. So if you miss out on a Premier League title, what's the loss you suffered there, and you can quantify those things. If you miss out on a Champions League qualification, everyone knows how valuable those Champions League spots are. Or if you finish lower down in the league, you miss out on certain merit-based payments. So the next question that everyone always has is, will there be an appeal? I suspect there will be an appeal. This could be brought by the Premier League or Manchester City, and we'd expect it within 14 days of the decision. There's also an option for appeal under another section of the Premier League rules, but this has very kind of limited circumstances. So look, whatever the outcome of this decision, this is certainly not the last you've heard of Manchester City in the Premier League, and I think we're going to be talking about this for a couple more years. But what I would hope is that what's been described as the trial of the century is resolved this century.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about the Manchester City case. I'm going to talk very briefly about how these rules might work or might not work as between promotion and relegation. And I think, honestly, perhaps those who drafted the rules, both the EFL and the Premier League, were less focused on that element, as they may naturally have been, as to how they may work in their own leagues. And it's created some anomalies. but it also made me reflect on the problem with points deduction as a sanction, in particular in relation to this issue. So the two examples I give, and I'll try and be as neutral as I can talking about them because I was involved in those cases, but I can't, it's difficult to be completely neutral when you've had that involvement. But the Nottingham Forest case, now those of us old enough to remember, Nottingham Forest were champions of Europe under Brian Clough, fantastic team. They hadn't been in the Premier League for over 20 years. They'd had a very long period outside the Premier League. And the year of their promotion, they were the only one of the three promoted that was not a beneficiary of parachute payments. Now, what does that mean? It means that when they were promoted and they had it's great for fans, but it's unfortunate for accountants and people who run clubs. They were unfortunate to get promoted through the playoff final, so you have less time to plan your squad investment and so on. It means that they have to spend quite a lot more to be competitive in the Premier League than any other club in the Premier League, and even the other promoted clubs who are the beneficiaries of parachute payments that are there precisely to enable them to continue paying the wages of Premier League players when they have been relegated, or at least to create a soft landing. So they're having to spend more money, and they spend more money. And some people say they went crazy and they spent far too much money, and everyone can argue about that. But they spent the money they spent, and they had planned a way to pass the PSR rules, which of course has already been indicated in one of their 3 years. They had a smaller amount of money they could spend because they were in the Championship. And the way to pass was to sell an academy player, which is the way that all clubs really at that sort of level can pass PSRs now, because it's a balance sheet profit. And so they identify the player, Brennan Johnson. They know that they can sell him for a large amount of money, and if they sell him before the financial year end 30th of June, they pass PSRs, everything is fine. They don't sell him before the 30th of June, they sell him at the end of the transfer window. So they fail PSRs, and so they're subject to, they're in breach, and they're subject to the points deduction we've seen. And all the arguments we may have run about how this is all a bit unfair because they've come up, they've had to invest, they tried to sell the player. All those arguments were basically rejected on the grounds, well, it might seem unfair to you, but those are the rules, and the rules are the rules, and you're stuck with them. So that was when Nottingham Forest ended. Leicester City, slightly different position. They get relegated, but they are relegated before the end of that financial year, the 30th of June. So they're no longer a member of the Premier League at the point when they could have done what Nottingham Forest tried to do, which is sell the star academy player, which in fact they also did to Tottenham shortly after Maddison, shortly after the closure of the expiry of the account period. That period, what they did and what they didn't do, they're no longer subject to the Premier League rules. And so that was part of their defence or jurisdictional challenge, or call it what you like, that they had against the Premier League. And they lost that at first instance and won it on appeal. And then there's been a lot of argument about that, and the Premier League has not been happy about that result and has said that, it allows cheating, it allows breaching. But one could say back to the Premier League what they said to Nottingham Forest, which is the rules are the rules, and if you don't like it, go away and redraft them. Those are your rules. But I think there's a more fundamental issue when you think about it, which is, why would it have been better for the Premier League to have jurisdiction over Leicester City? It would have meant that the Premier League would have had the power to impose a points deduction only in the Premier League, because they can't impose it in the Football League. So it would have meant that they could impose a points deduction on Leicester City in the Premier League. But what's the point of a points deduction? As Tom has just said, it's to maintain the integrity of the competition. It's to, if you like, punish or deter those who have breached the rules, but reward those who have not. Now, if you get relegated from the Premier League to the Championship, then how does a points deduction in the Premier League remedy anything? Particularly, you might stay in the Championship, you might do Nottingham Forest, stay in the Championship, or even go down and come up again for 20 years. So a Premier League points deduction isn't going to help anyone. And you've already suffered the worst thing you could suffer, which is relegation. And so whatever rule changes there may be about jurisdiction, there still seems to me to be this fundamental conceptual problem about imposing points deductions in different leagues at different times, where other clubs are going to benefit from it who haven't actually been complying with the rules in that league where they're benefiting from it. And it seems to me that one of the problems we've had, which is no doubt a result of my learned friend Mr. Lewis's, my colleague from Chambers, fantastic advocacy in so many of these cases, is that it has become a sort of accepted wisdom that you must have points deductions for breaches of financial fair play rules. But sometimes that just doesn't work. And it seems to me that if you need a sporting sanction, far more sensible or effective one for this type of situation would be something more like a registration embargo. If you have supposedly spent too much on players, you're not allowed to sign any players until, for instance, your books are balanced again. That is a very effective sporting sanction, but of course it would apply in the league you're competing in and not somewhere else. So that's just a thought about you can rewrite all the rules, but let's actually think about whether points deductions do make sense in all circumstances if there is a breach. So that's all I wanted to say on that, and we're going to quickly trot through so that I'm going to cut it off at 6:30 to allow you to ask questions. APTs first. I think Tom or Felix are going to lead on that. Which one of you wants to? Yeah, Tom.
Yeah. Now just so building on some of the next points, I think often the interaction between these various sets of rules is the thing that causes people's minds to get a bit foggy. So often, clubs competing in UEFA competitions will be subject to two sets of rules at the same time. And I think it's that thought process where clubs might get promoted to the Premier League and then mistakenly, or beyond their expectations, qualify for UEFA competition, and then suddenly be subject to what was a lower restriction. And I think often, it's the interaction between the sets of rules which can cause problems. So APT rules. So this is another case which has been rolling on involving Manchester City. So I'll try and give a fair summary in the time I've got. So these rules were introduced following the acquisition of Newcastle by a consortium led by the Public Investment Fund. Essentially, the concern was there was going to be a rush of Saudi sponsorship of Newcastle, which was going to then inflate their profits and allow them to do what Manchester City and Chelsea have done, which is to buy up lots of good players and compete with the big boys. So in order to address this, in December 2021, a set of rules were introduced by the Premier League, and this included an expanded definition of associated parties. So essentially the rules required any associated party transactions to be approved by the board before the club receives any consideration. The easiest way to think of these is like sponsorship deals. So if you have a sponsorship by Etihad, that would be deemed an associated party, and therefore that needs to be approved. This really impacted Manchester City because it had two kind of sponsorship deals lined up, one with Etihad Airways and one with First Abu Dhabi Bank, which were blocked by Manchester City. Manchester City then brought a challenge against this. In January 2024 was when Manchester City made a request for arbitration, and they argued that the APT rules were both anti-competitive and procedurally unfair. The Premier League then made a minor adjustment to the rules. One of the key issues in both the amended rules and the original rules was that they excluded shareholder loans. So if a shareholder, an equity participant, puts a loan into a football club to give them more money to operate, there was an exception under the rules to exclude this, so it didn't get caught. And often these loans will be at zero interest rather than, say, at 4% above the Barclays lending rate. So this is part of Manchester City's challenge. In September 2024, the tribunal found that certain elements of the APT rules were unlawful, and the two things they focused on were the exclusion of shareholder loans from the scope of the APT rules and also the process by which clubs were informed of benchmarking decisions. So essentially the league set up a process by which it could benchmark certain agreements and mainly focus on sponsorships, so they could work out whether the amount paid by one club or one sponsor was broadly proportionate to that paid by others. And given the fact that clubs were unable to comment on the benchmarking analysis that was carried out by the league, they said that was procedurally unfair. So in November 2024, a new set of rules were brought in, which then included shareholder loans as part of the scope. And in January 2025, Manchester City initiated a new legal action against the Premier League. It's going to be held by the same tribunal, so it hopefully will be resolved quite quickly. But again, it's part of the ongoing saga where people don't necessarily know what's happening at the moment.
Thank you. I'm going to jump straight across to the recent controversy about the sale of the Chelsea women's team from, I think, one entity of Chelsea to another, but Kieran will explain.
Chelsea announced on the 28th of June 2024 that the control of Chelsea Women's Team Limited had been transferred from Chelsea FC Holdings to Blueco 22, which is effectively the parent company. And there was no more details of that. Chelsea's accounts came out at the weekend. I think a lot of people had been curious, given that Chelsea has had significant investment into the men's team and the women's team, it has to be pointed out. In the accounts, we saw that the sale proceeds were £200 million. What is the value of a business? What is the value of any asset? Ultimately, it's a bit like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. But within the world of finance, there's sort of some guidelines. They're not tramlines, they're guidelines. If I'm choosing to buy a house, how do I work out how much I should pay for it? Well, I've just bought an apartment in Liverpool. There's 70 other apartments next to it. So therefore, I look at what the prices are next door, and you make adjustments. Have I got a better view? Have I got a bigger bathroom? Is it looking tatty than the other ones, and so on? So you can do comparative analysis. There's no evidence of any other club. Angel City in the NWSL, I think, was valued at around about $150 million. Angel City is playing to crowds of around about 16,000. Chelsea is playing to crowds that are averaging 4,000. So that seemed a little bit strange. Another way that you can value a business, this is, again, we refer to this as sort of quick and dirty valuation. You value it on a multiple. If we can say that on average, a business is worth 20 times its profit or 5 times its revenue, you can do some analysis for other deals, and we can apply that to the business in question. In the case of Chelsea Football Club, they were sold for, I think it works out as £19 of value for every £1 of revenue. Manchester United, arguably the biggest club on the planet, were sold for 7 times. Chelsea were sold for 5 times. Newcastle United were sold for 2 times their revenue. So this appears to be an outlier. You can value clubs on a multiple of profit, but we've got a problem. As I was explaining earlier, football's not a profitable business. Chelsea, in their most recent accounts, lost £8 million on revenue of 11. So you can't value a business you can't start off as -8 and multiply that by a number to get a positive number. So therefore, the revenue multiplier is one way we do. And the third way of valuing a business is to estimate future cash flows, put those into a magic machine in our spreadsheet, which we like doing, work out, using again a magic number, why £1 in 5 years' time is not worth the same as £1 today. We call that a discount factor, and it spits out a number. For Chelsea, realistically, to have a value of £200 million, and look, Chelsea's women's team are absolutely brilliant, and this is the thing which upsets me most of all. We've got a fantastically successful football team where all of the attention has been on the wrong things. You look at a discounted cash flow model, and it's very difficult to see, unless there's going to be spectacular growth. But I don't see people going to Kings Meadow. You know, Chelsea had 2,500 for their match, 3 weeks ago at home to Crystal Palace. So where are these future revenues going to come from that are going to develop the spectacular growth? So you look at all of the traditional model methods and they don't come out with a figure of £200 million. 50 or 60, if you're being generous perhaps, given that the buyer was the equivalent of the bank of mum and dad. And I put out on social media when this came out, the previous day, my granddaughter had drawn her picture of me. Now that has great value to me. Would I pay £100 for it? Yes. Would anybody else in this room pay more than a penny for it? No. So is this the same position that we have in Chelsea, that because it's so close to the overall business, we therefore are going to give it that paternal valuation? That is the only possible way of coming to that figure. The Premier League, as we understand it, are monitoring and reviewing. They have not agreed to that value. They've not disagreed to that value. So that's the position we have today.
I guess probably just also worth adding that the accounts obviously were signed off by a Big Four auditor, so they would have agreed to a material extent to that valuation as well, which probably increases the challenge for the Premier League to challenge the number.
I suppose it wouldn't be the first time that Chelsea have had something revalued by the Premier League though. So they sold their hotels for 76.3 million and that was then reduced by the Premier League by 6 million as well. So, you know, the Premier League have shown that they're willing to step in and revalue things if they think it doesn't quite pass the smell test.
It's probably also worth adding that won't come into obviously the current year's assessment that's now passed. So that will come into whenever that happens, into that period, that adjustment. So obviously that leaves the club open to other deals to try and obviously recover any adjustment they may or may not face.
Thank you. We were next going to do independent regulator, but maybe we'll do that in a minute or as an answer to questions, so we can open it up to questions now, if that's all right. So questions or comments either from the floor, or I think we've got a number of people who, we've got some already edited, do we? Here we go from Namit. How do financial sustainability rules in football balance their stated aims of promoting club stability against potential conflicts with antitrust competition law principles? Even if we consider the objective to be financial stability, is it proportionate? So I think that's a question for one of the lawyers. I'll look
I was going to say,
at you.
it's a good question for you.
Well, it's interesting because the only competition law challenge I'm aware of to the actual concept of financial fair play rules was one I was involved in many years ago for QPR against the very first incarnation of the English Football League rules. And that case famously lost, and the rules were found to be proportionate, even if they did, even if competition law applied to it. And the case has, unfortunately, for some reason, has never been published, but is referred to repeatedly in just about every other competition law challenge to a sports governing body rules since. So it really ought to be published so everyone can see it. But I wonder whether one would have the same result now, not if exactly the same arguments were run, but if perhaps some more sophisticated arguments were run than were run in that case. I wonder if you would have the same results, because we've had a number of far more interventionist decisions, both from the European Court of Justice, the Super League case, ISU case, and so on, but also in domestic arbitrations, in the football agents case last year and in the APT case that Tom just spoke about, where, and I think it's a result of the fact that more and more money has gone into football, and Premier League football in particular, where competition law challenges have been either largely or partially successful to the decisions of governing bodies. And the problem with financial sustainability rules are twofold in my view. First of all, they bake in inequality, they bake in status quo. The more you earn, the more you're allowed to spend. If you earn 10 times more than Luton Town, you can spends 10 times more than Luton Town, and that is in terms of not competition law, but in terms of simple competition as between clubs, it is anti-competitive. It stops people competing. It stops investment. And so it's difficult from a sort of sporting competition angle to justify those rules. And so that's why I think the traditional justification has been sustainability. And Kieran spoke about that. But I think the other side to that is Kieran may have done his argument down slightly, because the problem with some of those clubs that may be spending beyond their means is not necessarily that they are unsustainable. They are unprofitable, of course, but they are sustainable, maybe not in the Macorba sense, but they are sustainable in the sense that they have got owners and backers who are prepared to sit behind them and sustain them and keep putting money in. And the obvious problem is the the Derby counties or whatever, where the owner for one reason or another is no longer able or willing to put the money in and walks away. But there must be other more sophisticated ways to stop that, whether that's bonds over football wages and so on. And if there are more proportionate ways, then there is potentially a basis for such a challenge. I'm going to take a question from a couple of questions to the floor and then go back to the iPad if that's allowed. Yeah.
Kieran, you made the point about sustainability, but you focused much more on the Premier League. One of my challenges or feelings is that the rules should apply equally across the whole of the English football, because in the end, the leagues are interlinked. And when the parachute payment system was set up, the drops of revenues between the Premier League and the Football League, bearing in mind that it's only this year that TV money is going up by about 50%, and they're also going to be marketing the TV rights globally on behalf of both the Premier League and the EFL. We're now in a strange situation where a club like Ipswich Town, who've gone up back to back, have less money to be able to lose because 3 seasons ago they happened to be in the 3rd tier. And we're now in the situation where teams are effectively trampolining back up into the league, potentially Sheffield United being the latest example. And it's virtually impossible for we're virtually getting 3 clubs going up, going down, up and down. And it makes it very hard for clubs like Bradford, who've dropped down, to gain. Just wondering what the panel think, how we could optimise situations where we protect the spirit of the game, protect actual competition, to give people a fair shout.
Thanks. Kieran, do you want to go at that?
My view, I'm from an insolvency background, so I've done investigations into football clubs which were about to go into administration, ideally didn't go into administration, and so on. And my main issue is in form of the management of cash, which nobody talks about. We talk about profitability, sustainability, balance sheets. Nobody talks about cash flow. So I think there should be greater emphasis on good cash management. And I do think that we've stored up a lot of problems in all of the leagues. I think you mentioned those clubs. Luton Town have gone from the National League to the Premier League. Ipswich Town have gone from League One to the Premier League. Brentford have gone from League One to the Premier League. Brighton have gone from League One. So it can be done. Is it difficult? Yes, it should be difficult. This is the Premier League. It's a Premier for a reason. So therefore, those clubs who either at a board level have gone for an air shot, and if you take a look at Luton Town, they spent £28 million buying players in their first and only season in the Premier League. They really didn't try to stay. If you take a look at their wage bill, the average wage of a Luton Town player last season was £25,000 a week. It's a lot of money, but it's a third of the average of that of the Premier League. We saw similar with Burnley and Sheffield United. So I think that unless clubs are willing to be smart and trying to come up with solutions. And the poster boys for that are Brentford Football Club, Brighton Hove Albion, and so on. Then we are going to have this trampoline effect. Luton Town aren't going to get promoted this season. They are in danger of dropping down to League One. We saw Sunderland spend 2 seasons in League One despite receipt of parachute payments. Again, it comes down to, if you look at success of any business, opportunities, resources, and quality of executive management. That third issue, I think, is hugely underrated in the industry.
It goes back to my, if I could just say the Nottingham Forest example. You know, they go up without parachute payments. They're criticised for overspending. Luton Town were very sustainable and did not overspend. Who is in a better position now, Nottingham Forest or Luton Town?
I think you also mentioned parachute payments, potentially the necessity of those, but I think there has to be some system, mainly because of that sort of massive gap in revenue between the Premier League and a Championship club. And you know, you get relegated. You've still got all the same players on the books. Probably most don't have relegation clauses, because if you're a club in the lower of the Premier League and you want to sign someone and you put a relegation clause in their contract, they'll probably either refuse to come or won't sign it. So there needs to be some system to stop those clubs that get relegated from then effectively going bankrupt. So there has to be something. It might not be perfect as it is, and obviously we haven't talked about the football regulator. It's potentially a topic they may or may not look at, but yeah.
Yeah, this is an ongoing discussion between the Premier League and the EFL, and the suggestion at the moment is that the independent regulator will have a kind of a backstop process to, if the EFL and the Premier League are unable to agree the financial distribution model, that the regulator could then step in and decide that for them.
I've got a question from Kipros. What are the panelists' views on points deductions and interclub disputes for compensation? Will visiting the successes of clubs instigate a butterfly effect on the fate of other clubs, the outcome of which will be nearly impossible to determine or quantify? Who wants to have a go at that?
Sounds like a legal.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of points deductions, I think I made this point earlier. The rules were often sort of seen as sort of, you know, slap on the wrist if you didn't comply. I think since that imposition of those first points deductions, I think the picture's changed. The views of clubs, you see managers talking about it. It has focused the mind. So would be a point on that.
Although if you look at the EFL, like, point deductions were quite common and didn't necessarily resolve every issue, although the kind of new way of dealing, I think, in the EFL is slightly improved that. I think in UEFA, for UEFA competitions, fines tend to be the most common thing, presumably because a points deduction would then, to your point, Nick, would then affect the league in which they're in. But yeah, I think the big question is for Manchester City, if there is a points deduction that comes in, if actually that dates back to wrongdoing from 2008, 2009, 2010 onwards, you know, there's a gap between the wrongdoing and the punishment that's imposed that could be so great that you have to really question whether that is able to address the wrongdoing that happened so far in the past.
Yes.
Thank you. On the subject of the Premier League Man City case, I'd like to see if you can settle an argument between me and my colleague Ariman here. My conjecture, my theory, which is all mine, to quote Monty Python, is that perhaps the reason for the delay, the long delay, longer than expected delay, is that behind the scenes a deal is being done by all the parties. I don't think Donald Trump's involved, but it would make a huge amount of sense. From a commercial perspective, this will be so damaging to the Premier League, particularly if the previous titles are removed for Man City. So I can see a real commercial imperative for all of the Premier League clubs to draw a line under this. And I can see some sort of mediation, arbitration going on. It would need the agreement of all the clubs, because they'd need to agree not to pursue further cases. It just strikes me, everyone's been saying it's so long since initial verdict was decided on. Something must be going on. Do you think that's possible? Or
I think it's a sensible thing to do to have such a commercial solution to this dispute. But I think the fact that there's been a delay should not lead you to necessarily think that that is happening. And I also think that you know, for the reasons you've said, other clubs would want to have a say about that. And so it would be very difficult to keep it completely secret. And we know that so many things do leak out. So my own view is what you're saying might have been sensible, but is unlikely. And also that you've got 115 charges. You've had a hearing that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. It's going to take a long time to get through all that and write a decision. So I don't think there's necessarily been a delay. It's perhaps a time one might expect for this kind of decision. But you know, other people closer to the case may have a different view.
I just wanted to ask on the Man City case. Thank you. I just wanted to ask on the Man City case. Apart from Man City themselves, do you expect the outcome to have a profound impact on the rulebook of the Premier League and the way the Premier League operates? Anyone?
Tom?
I don't think I necessarily envisage there being any significant changes. I think it would depend on essentially it would depend on the outcome of the decision. We have, obviously, Felix has touched upon some of the changes that Richard Masters at least thinks will be coming in soon, and I think those changes are the things that we expect to see. Obviously, the changes will then have to be voted through by the clubs as well. So, I think the difficult point we're getting to is the Premier League is becoming sort of more similar to the EFL, where you essentially had 3 blocks of clubs that would vote against one another, and it used to be that the Premier League reached consensus on most things, and we're now in this position where certain clubs, Aston Villa, Newcastle, Chelsea, in some instances, Manchester City are now in a disagreement. But I think the most likely changes to the rules are the ones that Felix has touched upon.
I have one more question. Rob at the back.
Hi guys. Steve Parish made a comment recently that you've always been told football's not like an all business, your community asset. Yet when you get in a commercial court, obviously you're treated exactly like a business. So is it time for football to have some kind of carve out from competition law? And even if that was desirable in theory, is it ever possible? Like the American sports, NBA, NFL, etc., with the collective bargaining agreement.
The last point you made is a very good one, because it's, as I understand it, the labour exception, it's called in the United States under antitrust law, that allows them to have a carve-out from antitrust law. And one of the interesting things about one of the current big potential issues of anchoring that Felix spoke about is that is a salary cap. And it's a salary cap, or a type of salary cap, that the Premier League at the moment is refusing to get the consent of the PFA, the Players' Union, to agree to, saying that it's unnecessary to get the PFA to agree to that. And so it would be difficult in those circumstances, in my view, to sustain the view that because there is collective bargaining, which the Premier League is ignoring in this particular instance, something like that is completely immune to competition law challenges. Of course, the law is different in Europe and in England to it is in the States, and that labour exception is not established in the same way here. But I think it's you can't have one without the other. If you want to have a closed system, salary caps, immune from competition law, then you may have to have much more collective bargaining than we currently have. Any more questions? One more, and then we'll break for drinks. Yeah, go ahead.
Consequences of bad governance. So we've heard a lot tonight about bad governance and the consequences of that. What do you think could be done to incentivise good governance by clubs and kind of better management, so we avoid a lot of the consequences we've heard about tonight?
Felix, do you want to do that one?
Just trying to think. It's a good question. I guess the current approach is more of a stick in terms of the rules. Obviously, if you, I think good examples potentially to look at Tottenham, well-run club. They've managed to build a great new stadium, generating lots of additional income that potentially other clubs can't generate. So potentially the future outlook is very positive. Obviously, I guess if you look at sort of trophies and current results, that may not immediately reflect, but there's obviously other regulations that every company and you have to comply with in terms of your governance. But in terms of, I think you're probably right in saying in terms of the rules, they're more to stop anyone misbehaving as opposed to incentivizing. You don't get extra points for being profitable by 100 million, for instance. But I'm not sure that would also be work, to be honest.
You qualify for Europe because you make a profit.
Well, actually, you say that. I did recently read that UEFA are considering offering a place I think in the Champions League to the most profitable club in Europe. So that's a good reminder that potentially, I think the big debate currently though is what is profitability, i.e. what do you count? Where do you draw the line? If you're a Manchester United fan, you might say EBITDA because they're very successful in that area. But as you sort of start heading down the line and add interest payments in and other things, then you might be less profitable. So that maybe is actually a good example. Yeah.
Well, look, there's lots more questions and debate, but we can hopefully have those over drinks. And just to thank very much Tom and Simon and Mishkondareya for organising this, and the excellent panel, and all of you for listening and your brilliant questions. Thank you.